Hello everyone, welcome to Diplomatic Review. When Canadian Prime Minister Carney delivered the G7 Summit Chair summary, the G7 emphasized the importance of building a constructive and stable relationship with China, called on China to avoid market distortions and overcapacity, and expressed serious concern over destabilizing activities by China in the East China Sea and South China Sea. The importance of maintaining peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait was highlighted. In response, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun stated that the G7 summit manipulated China-related topics, made unwarranted comments and smeared China on Taiwan, the South China Sea, and the East China Sea, and falsely accused China of overcapacity and market distortion, interfering in China's internal affairs and violating basic norms of international relations. China has lodged stern representations with the relevant parties. Wei Jiakun said the biggest threat to peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait is Taiwan independence, separatist activities, and interference by external forces. If the G7 cares about peace, it should follow the One China principle, oppose Taiwan independence, and support China's reunification. At present, the overall situation in the East China Sea and South China Sea remains stable. The G7 should respect the countries in the region, resolve issues through dialogue and consultation, and join in efforts to maintain peace and stability. They should stop using maritime issues to stir up relations among regional countries and escalate tensions. Wei Jiakun also emphasized that the so-called claim of distorted overcapacity in the Chinese market is completely a false proposition. The G7 is using this as an excuse to practice trade protectionism. In essence, their real intention is to suppress and contain the development of Chinese industries, turning economic and trade issues into political tools. China once again urges the G7 to recognize the global trend of development, abandon Cold War mentality and ideological bias, stop interfering in China's internal affairs, stop provoking conflict and confrontation, and do more things that are beneficial to the international community. Compared to when Biden was in office before, this year's G7 summit was really disunited, and the relationship between Trump and the others? Not harmonious at all. This year, the malicious criticism against China wasn't as intense, but China was still a major focus for the G7. The most cunning move came from European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who, in order to persuade the US to remove tariffs on Europe, shifted the blame onto China. Once again, China was portrayed as a global economic threat, with criticism directed at China's restrictions on the export of key materials like rare earths and magnets. She even brought a magnet as a prop, trying to use visual effects to strengthen her argument. At the summit, von der Leyen accused China of weakening its competitors by subsidizing and weaponizing its dominance over critical raw materials. She called on the G7 to unite in response. In reply, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun specifically refuted von der Leyen's actions, stating that China's industrial subsidy policy adheres to the principles of openness, fairness, and compliance, and strictly follows WTO rules. He emphasized that the development of China's industries relies on continuous technological innovation, a well-developed industrial and supply chain system, robust market competition, and abundant and cost-effective human resources. It's real capability that we rely on, not subsidies. China's new energy production capacity has made a significant contribution to the global response to climate change and the energy transition. Wei Jiakun said that the so-called overcapacity is essentially some countries worrying about their own competitiveness and market share, and using this as an excuse to implement protectionist measures. What's really excessive is their anxiety, not the production capacity. In recent years, the EU has continuously introduced industrial policies and provided substantial subsidies to support European companies. They have even openly proposed giving priority to purchasing European products. According to incomplete statistics from 2021 to 2023, the EU will provide over 1.4 trillion euros in domestic subsidies, and by 2024, more than 300 billion euros have already been actually distributed. The EU has also introduced a series of economic and trade policy tools. At present, as the EU is working hard to promote economic growth and enhance competitiveness, it needs to abandon double standards and embrace greater openness and cooperation. It was emphasized in 50 years of diplomatic relations, China-EU cooperation brought benefits to both. China is committed to opening up and will provide a market and opportunities for European businesses. China is willing to strengthen EU communication, handle trade differences, and achieve mutual benefit and development. At the same time, China will firmly oppose any attempt to undermine China's right to development or to sacrifice China's interests in exchange for one's own benefit. When responding to the G7's actions, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs used relatively detailed language, but the wording was not particularly confrontational. This is likely because Canada's new Prime Minister, Carney, has made various statements after taking office that suggest a desire to ease China-Canada relations. Therefore, the content targeting China at this summit was not considered extreme. China also intends to improve its relationship with Canada to leave more room for flexibility when dealing with challenges from Trump. In contrast, regarding von der Leyen's actions, the response from China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs was much stronger, with a lot more information. The first point is that they directly criticized von der Leyen, saying that EU politicians, who can't compete with China's innovative manufacturing industry, are just using the excuse of overcapacity to protect their own industries. If they can't win, they just play dirty tricks. Secondly, the China-EU summit will be held in Beijing next month. On one hand, China is keen to promote stronger cooperation with Europe, but at the same time, they also warned von der Leyen not to think that China is trying to win over the EU, while the EU just makes outrageous demands. China has its bottom line and will not tolerate the EU sacrificing China's interests in exchange for a tariff deal with the US. If the EU does that, China will definitely retaliate. They won't just keep quiet just because the China-EU summit is coming up. In fact, after Trump started wielding the tariff stick, quite a few of America's major allied economies tried to shift the problem onto China, thinking they could use themselves as leverage against China. Letting it slide for a bit, Japan was one of them. But China quickly forced the US back to the negotiating table with its trump card, rare earths. Trump couldn't wait for Japan to act and rushed to reach a consensus with China. Japanese media described this as Japan losing an important bargaining chip. On June 16, Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba had a 30-minute meeting with US President Trump at the G7 summit. They only discussed the tariff issue, but both sides couldn't reach an agreement. Nikkei Asia's analysis on the 18th pointed out that Japan, as America's ally and biggest investor, tried to push for special tariff exemptions right from the start, but this actually made the US even less willing to give in. Originally, Japan wanted to play the China card in this round of negotiations. They proposed to strengthen cooperation with the US in areas like rare earths and semiconductors, but didn't expect that the US would first reach a trade framework agreement with China, causing Japan to lose this bargaining chip. After the meeting, at the press conference, Shigeru Ishiba said there are still points where both sides don't see eye to eye, so they couldn't reach an overall agreement. On the 17th, Trump also complained on Air Force One about Japan and Thailand being tough. He said, in the end, you have to understand, we'll just send a letter, and in that letter, it'll state the amount you need to pay. Otherwise, you don't have to do business with me. But if you accept it, then there's a chance. Neither Trump nor Shigeru Ishiba revealed exactly which issues the two sides are divided on. However, Shigeru Ishiba pointed out that the automotive industry is a major national interest, and Japan will continue to do everything possible to protect this interest. The automotive industry is crucial to Japan's economy. According to data from the Japan Automobile Manufacturers Association, 8.3% of Japan's workforce is engaged in automotive-related jobs, and the automotive industry contributes about 10% of Japan's GDP. The United Nations International Trade Center estimates that U.S. tariffs could deal a $17 billion blow to Japanese car exports. All along, the removal of auto tariffs has been a key focus in Japan's negotiations with the U.S. Shigeru Ishiba hopes to visit the U.S. on his way to attend the G7 summit in Canada, aiming to reach an agreement with Trump. He even told those around him, "I want to go to the U.S. because I think an agreement will be reached this time." But in the end, the U.S. suddenly changed its stance at the last minute, becoming much tougher, which caused the plan to fall through. A senior Japanese official revealed that although Japan's negotiations with U.S. Treasury Secretary Bessent went smoothly, Commerce Secretary Lotnick refused to make any concessions. Lotnick is in charge of industrial policy, including the automotive industry. And what about the automotive industry? It's actually the main reason for the U.S. trade deficit with Japan. That's why, when it comes to cars, her stance is extremely tough. From the very beginning, Lotnick made it clear that Japan would not get any special treatment. According to analysis by Nikkei Asia Review, as a U.S. ally and its biggest investor, Japan tried from the start to secure a special tariff exemption. This might have ultimately led to an even tougher stance from the US. Japanese media pointed out that the US's eagerness to negotiate with China was another miscalculation by Japan. As one of their bargaining chips, Japan originally planned to propose to the US that both sides cooperate in areas where the US and China have tense relations, such as strengthening the supply chains for rare earths and semiconductors. However, the US reached a framework agreement with China first. As a result, Japan's proposal was no longer attractive. Shigeru Ishiba originally hoped to reach an agreement with the US before Japan's upper house election in July, to give a boost to the election. But what did Trump do? He shortened his trip to the G7 summit, which led to no significant progress in the trade talks. According to the Asahi Shimbun, the outcome of the Japan-US leaders meeting has cast a shadow over Shigeru Ishiba's plans. Currently, Japanese exports to the US still face a minimum base tariff of 10%, as well as a 25% tariff specifically on automobiles. If Japan and the US can't reach an agreement before the suspension period ends on July 9th, Japan will also face an additional 14% retaliatory tariff at that time. According to a report by the Japanese research institute Daiwa Institute of Research, if the tariffs are raised to 24%, by 2029, Japan's real GDP is expected to decrease by about 2.2%. According to Japanese media reports, in order to reach a trade agreement, Japan has already held 6 rounds of negotiations with the US, mainly focusing on expanding bilateral trade, re-examining non-tariff measures, and strengthening economic security cooperation. Japan has already shown a willingness to cooperate with the US in areas such as shipbuilding technology and liquefied natural gas development, but there are still many differences between the two sides. On the 17th, Bloomberg reported that, for now, neither government has announced whether there are any plans for a meeting between Shigeru Ishiba and Donald Trump before the resumption of reciprocal tariffs. The Japanese government has also not announced the schedule for the next round of tariff negotiations. According to analysis by Japanese media, the following conclusion can be drawn: China's countermeasures against the US are not only precise, important, and swift, but even if the consensus framework reached with the US is not perfect, China still has to make certain compromises. However, by reaching a consensus with the US ahead of the EU and Japan, China has actually greatly reduced the chances of the EU and Japan trying to use China's interests as a bargaining chip in negotiations.